Well, thanks, Shaka. It seems that the International Conference on Somalia is underway in London, and the conference is aiming to provide international support for the government of Somalia as they rebuild their country after 2 decades of conflict. More than 50 countries and organizations are attending, including the United Nations, the African Union, and the International Monetary Fund. And as leaders from these groups meet to plan for a better future for Somalia, let's take a look at Africa as a whole, which brings us to our question of the week for today's program, saying, why does it appear that there is more instability than development in some African countries? Well, I'm going to first thank everyone for using all our social media platforms to communicate to us. Let's begin with a comment from Mathieu Ndlovu from Blantyre in Malawi, who writes, "It's because democracy is unknown in most African states by those in position of authority." Another comment comes from Herbert Herbiza from Lusaka in Zambia, who briefly stated that African leaders are very selfish. Well, Shaka, I know that most African presidents rarely get any love from our audience or from us. They get criticized a lot, which is normal. But to play a devil's advocate here, is it always their fault?
Well, I really don't know. Maybe, in fact, the man who might know 1 or 2 things about that has to be the man in Houston, Mlegwa Zihindula himself, because after all, he has actually worked with a real president. You know, I was once told that if, in fact, you want to write a book, you should actually talk, have a conversation with someone who has already written one. What about that, Mlegwa?
Well, you know, I think the caller is right about the problem for democracy, or what I call now an inclusive political system. You know, the problem in many African countries now is that so many people, some leaders, they want to stay in power for as long as possible, and those who are trying to wrestle actually power from them, you know, create havoc and so on and so forth. So the real lack of an inclusive political system is a very, very serious problem in Africa. And so I would say, I would agree with the caller, because many countries lack the system. And the fact of trying to stay in power so long stops many of these leaders for rebuilding their respective countries.
I see. Well, what about you, Frank? After all, we are always told by these leaders that power belongs to the people. And yet, we describe them as being selfish, as perhaps being greedy and what have you. What about our own role, we as citizens? Do we, in fact, do what we are supposed to do, or do we, in fact, behave as subjects of these people?
Actually, Shaka, in your question, you've just struck the real point. You know, there was an Afrobarometer report on Uganda where they went and asked citizens on how do you look at government? Do you look at government as a parent or as a servant? Mm-hmm. And the majority say they look at government as a parent.
Well,
so you can see that there is a whole wrong perception of looking, and this is the perception that builds on which the politics of patronage is built.
Paternalism and patronizing and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. But actually what I think is one of the biggest challenges of democracy and political progress in Africa is widespread civic disempowerment.
We'll come to that later in the program. Take it away again, Mariama.
Well, let's move on to another posting from Gahuwa Rui from Nairobi in Kenya, who writes, "We are heading in the right direction, but we should not compare ourselves to Western countries that have been in existence for many centuries while we're just reaching our jubilee," which is a great point. And finally, let's look at another one from Jimmy Busungwe from Kampala in Uganda, who asked this very interesting question. Has anyone ever wondered why the West makes weapons every day, yet they do not have wars on their lands? If they need a market for those arms, who do they go to? Well, Shaka, when I said interesting earlier, that's exactly what I meant. Is he, in other words, saying that countries that make weapons have no interest in seeing a stable, prosperous, and advanced Africa for economic reasons?